People. In what ways has your stupidity been brilliantly manipulated? My dad did these things for no reason other than to wind me up. He used to throw tiny pebbles at the top of my head every now and again when we were walking to school or whatever, and when I asked what it was, thunderbolt, came the response. I thought for many years I was lucky to have not been hit by lightning. The best was this ridiculous thing he did. So I'm about 7 or 8 in the garden, digging, and I found a piece of patterned ceramic. Being a child, I thought it was really cool and possibly an ancient relic, so I showed it to my whole family and put it in a box in the bottom of my wardrobe. Bedtime comes that night, and Dad comes in to tell me a story about a little girl who found an ancient relic in her garden. The story was about how the relic belonged to Hades, who came back across the river Styx to get it back. He tapped on her window slowly and just kept tapping. Eventually, the little girl got up and opened her curtains, and Hades was there, asking for it back. She refused. The fool. And he took the little girl to hell instead. Obviously, there were more details and tension. Dad is a good storyteller. Night-night, Lipio. Sleep tight. And if I were you, I'd put that pot back where you got it. Don't be silly, Dad. It's my treasure. I wasn't scared by that, and I told him that too. So I'm lying there, and I can hear this tapping noise. Very lightly at first, but then louder and louder. And I know my window's not near trees or accessible to people or anything. I'm lying in bed, convinced Hades is outside my window, but I'm too terrified to get the relic. I'm frozen with fear. Don't want to call out or move in case Hades sees or hears me. The tapping is getting louder and more urgent now. I'm seriously regretting ever digging anywhere, when I just heard my mom say, "What on earth are you doing, you silly old fool?" from the hallway, and she brings my dad, who can't stop laughing, in to apologize, because he was leaning out of the window next to mine. No mean feat. He had to get nearly entirely out, tapping on my window with a stick with the sole intention of scaring me. Nevertheless, I still took my relic back to the garden and buried it the next day. That ceramic piece must have had some serious dark magic to induce such terror. Story 2. When I was a kid, we lived in a rural area that didn't have garbage service, so we had to load our garbage into our car and drive to the dump ourselves. One day, while with my dad, I noticed a bunch of school buses and asked him why they were parked there. "Oh, that's dump school," was my dad's sage reply. "What's dump school?" "That's where kids go to learn about the dump and how it works." Now, I don't know why, but to my young brain, this sounded awesome. I wanted to go to dump school in the worst way. I bugged my dad about it all the way home until he promised that he would bring me. The next week, we went to the dump, and I was so excited. As we drove in, my dad started talking about something random. He masterfully kept me completely distracted the entire time, and I only remembered about the school on the way out. "Next week," he promised. Next week. Every week we went was like this. He would promise to drop me off and always distracted me, and I never doubted the existence of dump school after all. Why else would all those buses be there? And my whole family was in on it. They were always talking about how awesome dump school was. Finally, about 2 years later, my dad decided it was time to tell me that dump school doesn't exist. I was crushed. Not only was this awesome place not real, I also learned that my dad would lie to me for his own amusement. And of course, he got company and help doing a boring task, so it was a win-win for him. Who wouldn't want to attend a school dedicated to the fascinating world of garbage? Story 3. I'm coming in a little late, so this will probably get buried, but here it goes. When I was about 3 or 4, I got into this terrible habit where I couldn't fall asleep at night unless my mother was in the room. My poor mother spent countless nights sitting in a chair in my room until I fell asleep. For the first few weeks, if I ever woke up in the night and saw she wasn't there, apparently I would come into her room and bother her until she came back into my room. I was a little crap, I know. After the first few months of me doing this, every time I woke up in the night, I looked over to the chair by the door and saw that she was sitting there, waiting for me to fall asleep. This went on for about 7 years. Eventually, I guess I just grew out of it. One day, when I was about 10, I was cleaning out my closet, and this scarecrow fell out of the back of my closet, dressed in my mother's clothes. Apparently, my mom waited for me to fall asleep, planted this scarecrow in her chair, and went to bed. She did this every night for years, and my simple-minded child self never suspected a thing. Well played, Mom. Well played. Story 4. My parents are religious, and when I was young, I was into collecting all the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle action figures, the 80s to the early 90s ones. Well, I really wanted Pizza Face, because I didn't have that figure, despite having an article about it being one of the most useless toys of its time, and begged my parents for weeks to let me buy it. Well, one night, I was told to pray to Jesus that I'd been given the toy, and since it was a Saturday night and we go to church every Sunday, it didn't seem like an odd request. So I prayed. The next morning, I woke up to find the pizza face action figure in packaging next to my pillow in the bed. I was ecstatic. A few years later, towards the middle of the SNES life cycle, I really wanted that Super Mario All-Stars game, with the re-releases of the NES titles. Even though I asked for it for Christmas, I couldn't wait. And every day for the whole month of November, and some of December, I would pray consistently that I got the game early. I tried everything in my power to make my prayers into reality. I got the game on Christmas, but I was disappointed, to say the least. Even now, when something is missing, despite my being agnostic, I hear a voice in my head tell me, pray for it. Story 5. When we were maybe in 3rd or 4th grade, man, kids are gullible. One day my friend and I had our parents bring us lunch from a fast food place. As a kid, this is the kind of thing you brag about for days. Well, we were usually the first ones out playing in the field, but considering we had to wait for our food, we ended up devoting the entire lunch period to eating. Everyone asked us where we were when we got back, and what did we do? We conjured up a story about how we have an underground play area below the grass field where we have everything from swimming pools to bike ramps to a game room with billiards and arcade machines. Pretty much everything a kid could conceivably enjoy would be in this area. When they asked if they could see it, we told them that the only way to get in was to pull the one blade of grass in the field that wouldn't break when you yanked on it, but instead would pull open a door to the area. Whoever could find it could join us in Funland. We just lulled it off until the next day when, after eating our lunches, we strolled onto the field and saw maybe a dozen kids frantically plucking every strand of grass as they worked their way from one corner of the field systematically. They never got very far along. It's a shame, really. It's starting to get lonely down there by myself nowadays. Story 6. My grandfather used to put food coloring in the food for my father and his 8 siblings. Growing up in Utica, New York was hard for them. Half the time, my grandparents' union would be on strike. Usually the factory caved pretty quickly, but a couple times it lasted a month or two. Money was always tight, but during strikes they were absolutely penniless. So my grandfather would load up on as much cheap flour as he could buy, and they ended up having pancakes all the time, sometimes all 3 meals of their day. In order to keep their children happy and oblivious, they would have the kids pick a color of food coloring, or a specific topping to cook into the pancake. They would have to make up a story about why the pancakes were special. While fixing the pancakes, he would say, Mom and Pop have been doing real well at the factory this month. They gave us some extra time with you guys this week. You want to go to the park today? My dad, being the eldest at 11, figured it out but never said anything. Story 7. When I was a kid, my mother would occasionally make mac and cheese. I thought I was an awesome little chef and wanted to help with everything when, in reality, I was just getting in the way. It made her nervous with the boiling water and all, so she would give me the cheese packet, not the powdery kind, the gross but oh so delicious cheese goo, and tell me it needed mixing. I would sit on a stool in the kitchen for like 10 minutes poking at this little bag of cheese to mix it up. I did this last summer when I was making it for myself. I'm 20, and my mother saw when she passed through the kitchen and busted out laughing. I was just sitting on the stool, diligently kneading cheese. I felt like a bit of a moron when she explained her laughter. You'd think I would have noticed that it wasn't in the directions. Story 8. You know the knots on trees? My parents told my younger brother and I they were tree turtles, essentially the flying red turtles from Mario games. We were young and our dad worked as an arborist, so we assumed it was real. They used to freak us out when we'd go in the forest or go on a hike saying, "Oh look, one is hatched over there." One day, culminating in my little brother running out of the woods screaming and crying because he thought he heard one coming. The turtles were supposedly aggressive and would bite you. Our dad had a big scar on his arm from an accident, and he would tell us it was from a tree turtle attack while working. The messed up part about all this is that eventually they figured they should stop messing with us like this since my brother was getting so scared, but they never told us. So when I was about 14 to 15 years old, it just popped into my head one day. One of those things your brain randomly plucks from years and years ago. Hey, wait a sec. There's no such thing as tree turtles? Thanks, parents. Story 9. Oh, man. My parents were the reigning champions of making up stories for us to believe. I genuinely thought the color orange was purple and vice versa for many, many years. I was told that if I didn't go to bed at 9 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Santa wouldn't come. Now I have to stay up to arrange the presents on Christmas Eve because my 29-year-old sister refuses to stay up past 9. My mother told me that the dirtier a house was, the more likely it was to get robbed. So unless I wanted all my stuff to get stolen by bad men, I'd clean my room. My father convinced my sister and I that the grass on the lawn was lethal if it reached a certain length, but if it became mature enough, it would have the strength to grab feet and ankles, drawing its prey to the ground and consuming it. And that's why the lawnmower blades are made of metal. He used this to convince us to help him mow it. Story 10. When I was a little kid and needed my tonsils taken out, I got sent an anesthetic. It was allegedly bubblegum. I took one whiff of it and refused to keep the mask on. The anesthesiologist was extremely patient. He'd tell me I'd get ice cream after, and he put the mask on my stuffed cat and said, "Look, she likes it." I gave him a withering look and pointed out it was just a stuffed animal and couldn't actually smell it. The poor guy just sighed and said, "I'll make a bargain with you. If you keep the mask on for 10 seconds and you still don't like it, you don't have to wear it. We'll get you something else. Sounds fair?" Okay, ready? 1, 2. Story 11. Growing up, my siblings and I were picky eaters, and my parents had a hard time convincing us to eat stuff. In reality, if it was something we hadn't tried before, we really just picked up on how much they wanted us to try something, and just assumed it tasted like crap. We were usually right. So my parents decided, come Thanksgiving, they would act like everything they made was just the best and give no clue on if it would be icky or not. During this, my mom convinced all that the cranberry sauce was dessert and we could only put it on our plate if we finished everything else. Well, like every kid, we really wanted dessert, so we did what we were told. And then lapped up the cranberry sauce like it was ice cream on a summer's day. It wasn't until I was a teenager at my boyfriend's Thanksgiving that I picked up on the fact that most people don't consider cranberry sauce dessert. I have to say, though, I still love it to this day. Thanks, Mom and Dad. Story 12. One year, shortly after Christmas, my mother had made collard greens. I was about 5 or 6 and already pretty much wouldn't eat vegetables in the first place, but that stinky, slimy mess. So when I finally asked what it was, Dad goes, "Well, you know about all of Santa's elves?" "Yes." "Well, their little green shoes are made of leaves. And every year after Christmas, they get new shoes. They make this out of the old ones." Yeah, there was no way I was eating that. I reminded Dad of this story when I was in college. I don't remember telling you that, but it does sound like something I would have come up with. He says his proudest moment in parenting was when I was 7 and he told me about the Amish, and I refused to believe him because all the other BS he had told me. That's when I knew I had done my job as a father. Story 13. I posed this question earlier this week, but here it is again. My birthday is on St. Patrick's Day. When I was 8 or so, we lived next to a McDonald's. Around my birthday in March, my mom tells us that Shamrock Shakes are back at McDonald's. I asked what a Shamrock Shake is, and my mom replied, "It's a mint shake they make for your birthday." Me, being 8, heard, "It's a mint shake they make for your birthday." So I'm thinking, I got to get me a Shamrock Shake. The next day, I walk over to McDonald's and order my Shamrock Shake. The cashier proceeds to tell me that they're out of Shamrock Shakes. I look her straight in the eyes and say, "But it's me, PB&J." The cashier just gave me money back and moved on to the next person in line. When I told my parents what happened, they just laughed out loud and pointed. To this day, my parents still call me to remind me when Shamrock Shakes are back at McDonald's. Story 14. My childhood stupidity got me manipulated many times, but I got to manipulate my cousin who would not eat anything but junk food and cereal. I was tired of fighting with him to get him to eat a healthy meal while I was babysitting him one night. So I asked him if he wanted to be big and strong like his 22-year-old brother, and he immediately shook his head yes. He was a very small 3-year-old, and he was obsessed with being big, so I told him that every time he ate junk food or cereal for lunch or dinner, it would make him shrink and shrink and shrink until he disappeared. But every time he ate the food that was made for him, it would make his muscles bigger. He hasn't asked for cookies and cereal for dinner for 3 years since that night. Story 15. When I was little, my mom told me that if I didn't thoroughly wash my hands before bed, the cuckoo would smell all the food I'd eaten that day and come in the night to eat my hands off. One night I'd had enough of the excessive scrubbing and I declared that I believed she was a liar and there was no such thing as cuckoos. We fought and then she backed down and told me, "Fine, have it your way, but you'll be sorry." She then sent me off to bed with my ice cream doll, turned out the lights, and let me go to bed feeling triumphant. I woke up sometime in the night to find the hands missing off my doll and immediately freaked out and started screaming hysterically, etc. When my mom came in, I ran straight to her and cried out what was going on. She wrapped her arms around me and said, "This is why you need to wash your hands before bed. He mistook your doll for you, but next time, you might not be so lucky." There was nothing sinister in her voice at any moment, just a sweet, worried mom voice. I had a hand-washing problem for years because of this. The hotter the water and the harder the scrub, all the safer. Story 16. When I was a stubborn 6-year-old, I wouldn't eat my breakfast. My parents went out and bought a dozen different brands of cereal, trying to find something I'd like. The latest thing they brought home was cornflakes. I told them I didn't want any cornflakes. In their frustration, they tried to make them appealing to me by substituting the milk in the cereal for apple juice. I adamantly refused to eat it, so they dyed the apple juice green. Many minutes later, I still hadn't eaten the cereal, which had degenerated into some corny green mush due to sogginess. The parents then staged a conversation about how the cereal wasn't green enough, and how they would need to grind up more of their money to make it greener. Now, we were in the wealthiest family, so when I heard I was wasting money, I started crying. I ate the green, soggy mess, crying the whole time and dripping green dye everywhere. This must be why printer ink is so expensive. Story 17. This didn't really win my father anything but sadistic fulfillment, but when we were children, he told us all about Fizzy. They were little pets, apparently, but he never described what they looked like, or what they did, or what was so special about them other than the fact that they were awesome. He told us that he bought us some and that they were coming in the mail. We waited. We waited for months for these magical Fizzy. We would get McDonald's Happy Meal toys and pretend they were Fizzy because we were so tired of waiting. My parents ran a screen printing shop out of home, so they had an order of plain t-shirts shipped UPS to the house every week or so, and every time the UPS guy pulled to our house, we were stoked because we had false hopes that the fabled Fizzy had been delivered. Then one day, they arrived. My father had just gone home, and in a little box he presented to us were what he alleged to be Fizzy. This is what he gave us. I, for one, was angry and questioned my father's incredulous claim. I scolded him for ripping us off, and he said, "Wait, look, it moved." What? Did it move? Was the glittery pom-pom actually alive? Certainly he was lying, but how could I be sure? So I put my Fizzy down at the table and watched that for hours, and every time I looked away, my father told me that it had just moved, and that I had missed it. We put them in little jars with leaves and twigs and a little bit of water, and when in about a week I complained because the Fizzy wasn't doing anything, I learned that my poor Fizzy had passed away because I hadn't been feeding him. We buried our Fizzy in the backyard and learned a very good lesson about life. Then we got a puppy. Story 18. When I was younger, my family owned this happy little tank of 2 betta fish. Of course, there was a barrier between the 2 fish. Had there not been, the 2 would have ended each other. So one day I noticed my pretty red fish floating at the top of the tank. I ran to my dad, crying that my fish was sick. He told me that he would take it to the fish doctor. A week later, my dad took us to the fish doctor and told us to pick out a fish that looked identical to our older one, since the doctor didn't put the names of the owner on the fish tank. He did this more than once. This fooled me up until the summer of my sophomore year of high school. I noticed that my goldfish of about 2 years was swimming funny, so I told my dad to take him to the fish doctor. My dad burst out laughing and told me that the fish doctor didn't exist. Whoops. Story 19. My dad used to have a computer repair business when I was about 4 years old. Being a hyperactive child, one day my parents convinced me I was a robot my dad had built as a good little girl, and whenever I was bad, it meant I was malfunctioning, and he'd threatened to turn me off. Of course, I believed him, especially as the next couple weeks he offhandedly made comments about my CPU acting up whenever I was annoying him. He forgot about it after a while, but I spent years thinking I was a robot and was terrified he was going to turn me off. Finally, after years of mental anguish, I ran, crying to my father, begging him to turn me into a real girl as I didn't want to be a robot anymore. The shocked, guilty look in his face when he realized what he put me through I'll never forget. Of course, he thinks it's hilarious now and tells everyone. If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 20. My father was an evil genius, and my sister and I were stupid kids, so I have hundreds of these little gems. A few of my favorites, however. Every time I ended up in the hospital as a child, which, as my mother would describe it, was every time my father was in the field or on deployment. If he was there, he would tell me the same thing. If you're hurting, press that little dimple under your nose. There's a nerve there that goes straight to your brain and shuts off the pain. The more pain, the more you press. I'm pretty sure this only had 2 effects. 1, it is impossible to talk when trying to press your top lip through your teeth. And 2, I ended up needing braces. One of my most favorite, though, was done to my sister and not me. When my sister was a little girl, she had a habit of lifting her dress up over her head like many little girls do. My father came up with the most ingenious method of stopping her from doing this. He told her, "Don't do that. People can get your belly button. If they untie your belly button, your back will fall off." So far as I know, she never did it again. When she was in high school and in college and on the baton squad, she would never wear an outfit that showed a bare midriff for fear that someone might untie her belly button. In retrospect, as a big brother, I wish she had come up with something ingenious. Story 21. I was born into a military family. My mother is Filipina. My grandmother had essentially lived with me all my life, except for the fact that I did not know her as my grandmother. I knew her as Lola, which means grandmother in Tagalog, national language of the Philippines. Now, I never realized this because when I was 5 to 7, I lived in Guam, and I specifically remember talking with a classmate of mine about my Lola. Lo and behold, he said he had a Lola too. So I just thought Lolas were semi-normal and some people had them and some people hadn't, and never gathered any relation. Fast forward to when I was about 9 years old living in San Antonio. My mother told me that my Lola wanted me to stop calling her that in public. I was perplexed. She said she wanted to be called Grandma. I was angry. I really had no idea or ever questioned that Lola was my mother's mom this whole entire time of my life. They just simply never told me. Part of it was because when they spoke Tagalog, my mom always seemed kind of mean to her. She passed away 2 years ago, and I still miss her. R.I.P. Lola. Story 22. I've got two. First, way back in the day, seatbelt laws had just come into effect where I live. The fine was over $50. They told me I didn't have to wear the seatbelt, but I'd have to pay the fine if we were caught. When your allowance is $1 a week, you put that belt on really fast. I still can't drive in a car without wearing a belt. It doesn't feel right. Fast forward to the present. My sister-in-law had my kids in the backyard. Some Smarties were spilled on the lawn. Kids wanted to eat them. She said, no, let's bury them and plant a Smartie tree. They buried them. Later in the summer, she comes over, sneaks around back, and jams a 2-foot-high plastic tree in the ground. Attached to some of the plastic leaves with pipe cleaners are the mini boxes of Smarties like the ones you got on Halloween. Needless to say, my 3- and 5-year-old lost it. The little one is starting kindergarten, and I can't wait until the teacher asks her what grows on trees. Story 23. When I was a kid, I got into trouble a lot, which means I was disciplined a lot. So even though it was because I didn't know better but needed to know where boundaries were, I started to feel like I was becoming a bad kid. Nothing I could do was really making it better. I would learn the boundaries but would still find ways that would get me into trouble. My mom felt bad but knew she had to be consistent. She came up with a plan. She took a black garbage bag and duct taped it to a paneled wall. We lived in a trailer park at the time. Couldn't make it much worse. She told my brother and I that this is a land to the monster world. It's only for bad kids, especially bad little boys. If you're a bad boy, then you'll fall right in, but if you're really a good boy, then you won't ever fall through. So I was dumbfounded. I woke up and there was this portal into another world. I had to be around 4, mind you. Every day I was so scared to touch it in case I would fall through. And one day I was clumsying around the home and I fell backwards and landed on the bag. I almost started crying, but then I realized that I was still standing in my home. I put my hand on it and tried to push through. I couldn't. I ran, screaming across the house. I'm really a good boy. And gave my mom the biggest hug. You don't have to worry. The monsters can't get me. I'm a good boy. My mom smiled and said, yes, you are. Since then, when I would get in trouble, I would check the bag to see if I was really a good boy. It really helped my self-esteem as a child and helped me to learn that even though I did things that got me into trouble, I was still a good boy through it. My mom is so smart. I'm stealing this. Seriously, this is parenting gold. Simple yet brilliant way to instill good behavior. Who needs timeouts when you have a monster-infested garbage bag? Story 24. My 2-year-old sister always had been and still is a manipulative, nifty little diva. When I was about 4, we were sitting at a haircut place with my mom waiting for my sister's appointment. We were getting bored and impatient, so Mom took out her box of Tic Tacs and gave us each one. My sister put it in her mouth and slipped it under her upper lip, looked at me, and said, Look, I just put my Tic Tac up my nose and down into here, pointing to the bump under her nose. You can probably see where this is going. I was amused at this, and like the mental midget I was, I shoved the Tic Tac straight up my nose and started putting it in. Eventually, it got stuck. My sister was laughing hysterically. Mom looks over, yells, Oh crap! And drags us out of the building to her car. We headed to the hospital. As we're pulling out of the parking lot, she looks at me and says, Do not put things in your nose anymore. Just as she finishes her sentence, I take one final sniffle of faith and the little guy flies right out. Story 25. When I was about 3 years old, I got sick and had to take medication. It turns out I'm allergic to penicillin. Because my parents didn't want me to be afraid of medication, they told me I was allergic to Fritos instead. I loved Fritos. It wasn't until I was 11 when I asked why my parents had gone Fritos because I was allergic to Fritos. My mom confessed, and I was appalled because I'd been afraid of one of my favorite foods for years. Another related story. I used to pick dandelions as a child. My mom would get annoyed with me picking them as they would stain my hands and legs. I would also bring them into the house, which was quite irritating to my mother, who would find them scattered around the house. She told me I was allergic to dandelions, and I believed her for years. Apparently, the allergy lie was a common excuse for my parents. Story 26. I was around 10 years old and was spending a summer day at my babysitter's house. We used to play all types of board games and even SNES if I was on my best behavior. But in this particular day, I spotted the game Risk. I was instantly intrigued as the box was covered with awesome pictures of people raising bayonets and firing cannons. I told him I wanted to play that game, but I could tell immediately he didn't want to. Now, looking back, I can tell he didn't want to spend the next 6 hours playing a strategic war simulator with a 10-year-old, but I had no clue at the time. He told me that I wouldn't want to play. When I insisted that I did, he winced and told me I really didn't, because apparently the players took turns aiming cannons at each other's mouths and firing tiny cannonballs down each other's throats. His ruse worked, and I stayed far away from that game until I was about 16 and got peer pressured into playing, where I silently sat there sweating as some dudes explained how to play. When no one mentioned the cannonball part, I thought they were messing with me and going to take advantage of the fact that I had never played. It became clear to me how much of a tool I was when they set up the game and there wasn't a cannonball inside. I still think about my babysitter every time I see the box art. Story 27. My dad was in sales and traveled a lot. My mom and I tagged along whenever I wasn't in school. I loved staying in hotels because we would always find one with a pool. I remember one night it was getting pretty late and I was anxious to stop for the night so I could swim. My dad told me to keep an eye out for hotel signs, so I did. When I saw one, I would point it out and ask, "What about that one?" The first several that I saw had the no vacancy sign lit up. My dad just kept saying that we didn't want to stay there since there was no vacancy and to keep looking. I asked my dad what no vacancy meant, and he told me that it meant the hotel didn't have a pool. So from that point on, every sign I saw that said no vacancy, I would say, "There's a hotel, but it's a no vacancy, so I don't want to stay there." You never had to. Story 28. For Christmas every year, my parents would get out, unbeknownst to me, along with all the other decorations, an old school toy shelf, sort of a stuffed toy but old British design. They would tell me that he was watching me for Santa to make sure I was good and to see if I deserved coal or presents. The head came when they started moving him around the house. Each day he would be somewhere else, watching and waiting for me to mess up. Dining room, lounge, bedroom, even bathroom. Nowhere was safe. I was always being watched. The real head was what they told me about him. If you touch Santa's helper, all his magic is released and he becomes a toy. Then Santa will be really mad because you ended one of his elves and you won't get any presents ever again. It took me until I was 14 to work out that it was a toy, and only because it fell off its perch on the lamp and I caught him in my hands before promptly realizing what I had done. That took some rather hefty explanations. Then again, they got 14 years, minus 1 or 2, of a very well-behaved child at Christmas. Story 29. My mother, in cahoots with my grandparents, convinced me of the boogeyman's existence. This isn't weird. It is the detail they went to, and for no real purpose. My grandmother has this candle. It is a green candle in the shape of a Chinese figure in beautiful flowing robes. They convinced me that this was in fact the boogeyman. At nighttime, he would grow to 12 feet tall and sashay around downstairs in his flowing robes. He would glide across the floor and patrol, waiting for children. When I would hear creaks in the house or someone walking downstairs, I would silently cry in my bed. I was never told what would happen if he caught me. I sure as hell was not going downstairs at night to find out. To this day, I stare at that candle at her house. The moment she passed away, I'm on a freaking plane to light the candle and watch the thing disappear. Scary freaking candle. Story 30. My parents were wonderful, loving, horrible people. First, my dad would tap my twin brother and me on the shoulder and say that it was the invisible little slinky man. Until I was maybe 5, I thought there was this invisible person who looked like the classic diner big boy, if you were able to see him, flying around and landing on people's shoulders, giggling at his prank. The most egregious manipulation was Mrs. Brown. My parents told me when I was a kid that if we were bad, they would take us to Mrs. Brown's house, where there was no TV or entertainment, no food, and if we did anything that could be possibly interpreted as misbehavior, she'd hurt the ever-loving crap out of us. The worst part is that we lived in the outskirts of a decaying city. In my childish prejudice, I started to think of Mrs. Brown as a brown lady who lived in a tenement and wanted nothing more than to hurt children. When I was 8 or 9, I asked my parents whatever happened to the Aunt Jemima who would send us to the hospital if we didn't flush the toilet or say please and thank you. They were utterly confused. Story 31. Jeez. I remember being a kid, like 3 or 4, taking a nap next to my mom in her bed. There were 3 pillows in her bed, and I wanted to use 2 of them. So instead of telling me, "No, I'll use 2, you use 1," she proceeds to ask me if I want to hear a story. It went like this. There was once a little girl who was getting ready for bed and had a bunch of pillows. The little girl used too many pillows to sleep that night, though. So her head was pushed up and she couldn't breathe and she passed away in her sleep. Now, I'm a guy and I was a little guy at the time, so I didn't really have any reason to not believe her. But I remember giving her the extra pillow. For like 20 years, always thinking, no, 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 can't have too many pillows. And it finally happened. That one night when I was drinking with some friends and people were going to sleep, I told them, dude, are you stupid? Why are you using so many pillows? You'll pass away. Your neck will pinch your trachea shut and you'll pass away in your sleep. To which my friend replied, are you joking? And it was then that I realized I had been trolled by my mom all those years ago. Also, I didn't learn how to properly blow my nose until I was 19. I had to have a girlfriend teach me, and I didn't know you could recharge glow-in-the-dark items by putting them by the light. I'm smart, I swear. Story 32. I'm a bit late to the party, but I have a couple to share. When I was little, my dad used to always tell me that in order to grow and properly develop, my brain needed to be watered. In the shower, I was supposed to let the water flow into my ears until they filled up and drained out. Weird enough, but okay. I already believed that eating watermelon seeds would grow watermelon in my stomach, so whatever. I distinctly remember several occasions when I would be woken up in the middle of the night with warm water being poured in my ear. Daddy, what are you doing? I would ask, and the reply was always, I'm watering your brain, son, so you'd be smarter than me. Another one that amuses me is that I was always told to grab my jewels when I coughed. When I asked my dad why, he said that if I didn't, then I would get cancer and they would be removed. Found out years later that an old man he knew when growing up had told him this, and he still, to this day, cups the grapes when he coughs. Story 33. When I was a kid, my uncle had a garden in upstate New York. At the beginning of the summer, I asked him if I could plant some watermelon seeds. He said, sure, and I did so. A month later, there was a little vine with tiny pea-sized watermelons growing on it. As I would come up on the weekends, I would check the growth, but nothing changed over the course of a few more weeks. One evening, after I was expressing my disappointment over the lack of progress, he told me that watermelons are incredible in the way that they can grow tremendously overnight. I didn't think much of it, but on the way home from town the next day, he told me to check on my watermelons. Lo and behold, there was a medicine ball-sized watermelon sitting where only a pea-sized one had been the previous day. With such glee, I rushed over to pick it up, and upon rolling it over, I saw the price that had been written onto it at the supermarket from where it had been purchased. The laughter that ensued had been echoed over the past 35 years each time the story comes up. It's been gone now for years, but I have a memory that will last forever. Story 34. I can't remember anything I actually believed, besides the non-existent hidden cameras in our room to make sure we weren't fighting. But my favorite thing my dad figured out recently is kind of adorable. My dad grew up during the height of the Cowboys and Indians era of TV and radio. My grandfather, who passed away in 2003, was always this pretty serious guy. He loved his kids and he knew how to parent. He wasn't super strict, but I guess he wasn't a family game night kind of guy. Well, my dad suddenly realized one of the sweetest lies he ever told him. My grandfather apparently had a scar on his arm, most likely from working on the railroad or maybe World War II, so he would tell my dad and his friends that he got struck by an arrow. All the kids believed him. My dad hadn't really ever thought about it until recently, and he got all emotional about it. I thought it was sweet. Which reminds me, my dad worked for the railroad as well, and one year he put coal in my sister's Christmas stocking. Story 35. I grew up in Hawaii for the first half of my life. When I was about 2 years old, my family moved into a new house, and on the other side of the road was a huge sugarcane field. To keep me and my sister from wandering in the cane field, my parents told me all about scary monsters that would grab us and eat us if we got too close to the cane field. This made going over to my neighbors interesting since we would run as fast as we could to their house, along the edge of the road farthest from the cane field. I questioned about it last year. I'm 27. My mother just said if we would have gotten lost in a cane field, it would have been impossible to find us again in the sugar cane field, so I guess I can't blame her. Although this gave both my sister and I a horrible fear of the dark or anything scary for most of our life. Story 36. This is related to when everyone cooked with wood or coal-fired ovens, and one of the baking ingredients of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. This was true. The loud noises, bangs, and vibrations from people running, walking heavily around and jumping, slamming doors, etc., would make the wood and coals fall, causing a flame-up. Also, baking powder was not as well made and could be very fidgety. A slight thump could cause a drop and could pull the entire cake in on itself, or make cookies hard as rocks. Depending on the cake, too. Angel food or a genoise can fall in an instant even today. This is also why cooks had to sift flour and powder ingredients so often compared to today. However, in the 1950s ovens, baking ingredients and processes improved exponentially. So if your mother grew up in the 1920s to the 1950s, she was correct in not manipulating you. She grew up post 1960s. She totally screwed with you. Story 37. When I was younger, I had a pet boa fish. Its nickname was the fighting fish. Me and my sister's fish shared a tank, and there was a divider separating the fish. Every so often, my fish would slip onto her side and fight it. When we woke up, my mom would just say that my sister's fish was resting on the pebbles at the bottom. It would go to school and come back, and it would be all better. However, one day, I guess my mom finally gave in and said my sister's fish passed away. A week later, mine passed away too. We then went to the pet store and bought a new fish named Shiny. Yes, I am that original. It lasted about a month before it passed away. A couple weeks ago, I went to the pet store and came back with a boa fish in a new bowl. My mom asked why I chose that fish, and I said because they lived for years. My mom then burst out laughing and said she would replace her fish every time it passed away and we wouldn't notice. I can't believe I never looked at my fish close enough to figure it out. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.